Welcome everybody. So I just started recording, so we'll be recording from here on out. Again, feel free to leave cameras on or turn them off as you prefer, and I'd appreciate it if folks could mute themselves except when they're talking. This, I think, is going to be not a huge group, so I think we'll be in a position to have questions pretty informally. We're not going to hold them till the end. We'll just do them as we go along, I think. But then we'll also have some info at time at the end for questions as well. We're scheduled for 2 hours. I think it's entirely possible we will not take the full 2 hours. Let me make sure that I am telling you the truth on that we really, hour and a half. No, I did say 2 hours. Okay, again, I think it's quite possible we won't go 2 hours, but it depends on what the questions look like. So thanks everybody for coming today. This is the basics of computer networking. This is the first time that I have led this, so it may be a learning process for all of us. I'm hopeful there'll be a lot of information in here, but we can see if there might be a better way to organize it next time around. So I'm totally open to feedback afterwards as well. But again, we're going to do this pretty informally. We'll put slides up, we'll talk about them, and then as questions come up, you can feel free to put your hand up, put things in the chat, or just pop in. I think we're at just about the amount where that's still practical. If it ends up being an issue, we'll just hold questions for chunks. But thanks so much for joining, and let's just get into it. Okay, first off, for what we're talking about today, and again, I just want to emphasize this is basics of computer networking. It's certainly possible that your knowledge may outstrip what we're talking about today, and I'm happy to answer questions that you might have that are not things we're talking about, but I just wanted to give people sort of a ballpark for what we'll be talking about. So for what we're talking about today, computer network is all the equipment that allows the computers and other devices, tablets, phones, etc., in your building, printers, everything, to reach the internet and to, where necessary, reach each other, including both wired equipment and wireless equipment. So that covers a lot of ground, but basically we're talking about everything that is in between the outside internet and your devices. That sort of falls into a couple of broad categories for devices. For the wired stuff, the wired side, we're going to talk about, and I'll have a little drawing in a second that may or may not help illuminate this, but wired devices include things like modems, routers, switches, and we're going to explain what all these are in a minute, and just the physical cabling that is in your building. And then wireless devices are basically wireless access points. They can also be called wireless routers, but that is mostly what we're going to be talking about today, with a few little nuggets of how networking works kind of scattered in. So thank you much. All right, and we will move on. Okay, so here is my beautiful drawing of what a network looks like. In my heart of hearts, this was the first draft, and I was going to make this lovely vectorized version in Illustrator, and that did not happen. So this is roughly what a network looks like. At least it's what it looks like in Josh's head. And we're just going to sort of march our way from through the network, from the outside world to devices. So number one is modem. And let's see. So actually, I will start with. I'm gonna stop and start sharing on and off in this. I apologize, but I am, because I want to show you some stuff, physical stuff. This is what a modem roughly looks like. This is actually like an 8-year-old modem, so your modem might look a little bit different. All of these things look like little boxes, unfortunately. So they all kind of look similar, but little box, lights on the front, in the back, depending on what kind of, and we'll talk about different kinds of modems, what kind you have. There's sort of an in from whatever the outside world is, and there's a Ethernet jack that leads out to everything else in the world. Again, yours may look different than this. It may have a bunch of other functionality. It may be a bigger device, or it might look like a pillar or something, but this is generally roughly what a modem looks like. All right, so let me go back to sharing, and I apologize. This will probably hiccup just a smidge back and forth. Okay, and we are on modems. Okay, so modems. They may look different based on the technology that you are connecting with, but they basically all do the same thing. So if you have, that was a cable modem, which is if, Comcast, Spectrum, somebody like that. If you have a fiber connection, the device will look different, but will do roughly the same thing. In some cases, the device might be bigger, probably not smaller, but might be bigger, particularly for fiber. If you have a satellite connection, same deal. It's going to be a box that looks kind of similar, but or slightly different, but does the same thing. Basically, what a modem does is connects your network, whatever it is, and almost everything. Sorry, I should say this. Almost everything I say today also applies for home networks. They're just going to be probably less elaborate, but all the pieces work basically the same at your house, apartment, etc. So what a modem does is connects your network, however big or small it is, to your internet provider's network. It's just a way to get from A to B. And the provider's network, and thus the internet as a whole. Okay, so modems. How do you get a modem? This is sort of different than some of the other ones. So your internet provider may give you one for free. It may just be part of your monthly cost. It gets in there, boom, it does its thing. They don't charge you. So that's one possibility. Number two, and I think this is more frequent, is that they will give you one, but they'll charge you a monthly fee, $5 a month or something like that. And it still looks like the same thing. In some cases, you may have the option of buying your own if you want to get out of that monthly charge. And you just kind of want to look at the math there. They probably are not, it's probably going to be $5 a month. It's probably going to be $100 for a modem. You can figure out if you want to deal with it, want to deal with finding the right thing. But if it's $5 a month in perpetuity, you may end up wanting to buy one yourself. Okay, so a modem, again, there's very little to configure on the modem side. This is if it's just a modem. It basically is working or it's not working. There's the lights on the front. While it's active, those will probably be flashing, but they give you a little bit of diagnostics. If it's out, it may tell you whether the cable modem is where it's out. And if for example, any of your other services, if there may be a light that says basically that it's not on, means that the network isn't working. There's a cable outage, or there's something wrong with the fiber or something like that. So it can be a starting point. So it has lights. In addition, they usually have a web interface. They don't exactly always tell you how to get to it, so it may require a little bit of work. But it's usually, if you go on your network, you put in a certain IP address. We'll talk about IP addresses later. You can maybe get to your modem and see a little bit of diagnostics. But at the end of the day, you don't have to, there's no settings in here. There's nothing that you really change. So it's pretty basic. It just kind of does its thing. I will say, also, the provider can see your modem. So sometimes if you're having trouble, you'll talk to the provider, you'll call tech support, and they'll say, oh, your modem says X or Y. That's modems. I'm going to talk about one more thing, and then we're going to pause for questions about modems. I don't know that there will be a lot of questions about modems, but okay. So I sprinkled in a bunch of sort of asides that somewhat relate to the device we're looking at, but also have a little broader impact. So this is about combination devices. This is particularly your internet provider, especially residential internet providers, but possibly also commercial ones, have a tendency to sort of stick everything into one device because it's cheaper and easier for them. So you might get a modem that is also a router, that is also a firewall, that is also a wireless access point, sort of all in one thing. Um, and that's totally fine. That's not an issue for you. It's it's one less or one or two less devices as well, so it's sort of positive from that. But one thing to be mindful about that is that you just because it does all these things, you might want a different device that gives you more options. This is most, I'd say, especially relevant for Wi-Fi because they're going to give you one of these. You'll stick it in the middle of your building, and you may say, "My Wi-Fi is terrible because it's only coming out of this one little thing that looks like a tiny trash can." And that means you can still totally use other devices in addition to whatever thing they give you, that's even if it's an all-in-one. Um, so again, it might also be true, you might want a different router and firewall, but Wi-Fi is the most relevant one, I think. You will find in many cases, unless you have a very small building, that the one vendor, the one provider device is probably not going to reach your whole space. Okay, so we're going to take a little pause. So that was just modems, but does anybody have questions about modems or what we've covered so far? Feel free to put a hand up, put something in the chat, or just unmute yourself and ask. Again, not the most exciting part of the day, but modems are crucial and yeah, anyway.
I actually do have what probably is a very stupid question.
No,
in terms of
no stupid questions.
Access. Well, I don't know. Wait until I ask it before you say so. In terms of access for wireless, what is the range typically, and I guess the building material that it can actually work its way through? So, I mean, how do you know how many boosters you might need and the distance and spacing of those?
I'm gonna, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna table that for now, because we will get on sort of a really Wi-Fi focused section. But make sure if I don't feel that you prod me again, and because I think because that's a great question and it's definitely not a stupid question and is in fact maybe a pretty hard question. But we can definitely, when we get there, we can talk about sort of ballpark places to start. So let me, you know what? I'm gonna write that down, or I might forget it. How many boosters? But yes, we will definitely field that. Wi-Fi is about 2/3 of the way through this PowerPoint. So, any other questions that folks want to field right now? Okay, we are going to jump through. We get back to my beautiful drawing. Okay, so here is your router. And again, in some cases, some of the stuff is stuck together, but I'm sort of breaking out the functional separation because I think it's really important to know what each of the pieces do, even if they all are kind of stuck together. Okay, so router. Now I'm going to show you pictures of a router. I'm going to not do break down the PowerPoint. I'm just going to show you. So let's see. Am I spotlighted? Okay, I just spotlighted myself. Hopefully it's easier to see. Okay, so this is a old router, but is sort of the thing that you might remember from having used probably at your house. It has lights in the front. The lights might give you diagnostics. They mostly just show you that it's working. In the back, you have some number of Ethernet jacks, somewhere between one and is enough for you to do all the things you want to do. So that is sort of how you're going to see identify a router. In this case, it also has Wi-Fi, so that's what you're seeing here. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So that's a little kind of old and consumer level router. I'm going to show you two also old, because that's the stuff that I have that is not in use, but a more robust one. So, and heavier. Okay, so this, again, I said everything looks like a box, and that is the unfortunate truth. They all look like boxes. This is a Cisco router from 10 years ago, give or take. So it has a few lights. It looks a lot more like a computer and weighs a little bit like a computer. But It is basically just like an inflated version of the last thing. So you see on the back, it has a bunch of Ethernet jacks. It has, and that's mostly what we're looking at. This one is also has Wi-Fi here. Boom, 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 boom. But we'll talk about that later. And one more, but very similar. Here's an even bigger, but also 10-year-old version. It just looks like straight up like a computer at this point. But on the back, same deal. You see a series of Ethernet jacks. Okay. So let's move forward on that. What does a router do? Basically, the router connects the modem to everything else in the network. It sort of keeps track of what needs to go where is maybe a basic way of describing it. It sort of, yeah, it keeps track of all the devices that are on the network. It knows what their address is, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It allows them to reach the outside world. It allows them to reach each other. And it is sort of the central point of the network in a sense. It is and is one of the most important pieces in it. Okay, so it also a firewall. A firewall can be a separate device, depending on how, or it can be built into the router. A firewall basically allows things to go out. Its default allows things to go out and does not allow things to come into your network. That's sort of its basic structure, but you can tweak it infinitely beyond that. So if there are things that you don't want people accessing outside your network, that's probably not the case at a library, but you never know. That's a thing you can do with your firewall. If there are people who need to be able to get in for some reason to do X or Y, you have a consultant who needs to look at your network. You have a device that needs to be able to be reached by the outside world. You have a server or something like that. You make very specific openings in your firewall so that people can get somewhere. Again, so in many cases, it might just be part of your router. In some fancy cases, it's a whole separate thing. I don't know how often that will happen at the library scale, but certainly as you get bigger and more corporate, that's a thing that happens. Along those lines, routers and firewalls, I just sort of implied this, have a lot of configuration options for customizing your network. There are a lot of, they will in many cases just work out of the box, but there's a lot of things that you can do to specify how you want your network to function, how you want various devices to see or not see each other. And depending on the complexity and cost of your router, it can be a number of configuration options or in a huge number, a huge quantity of things. So it's easy to get into the weeds in that a lot. It's just the main point is that there are a lot of settings in here that you can change or that someone you're working with can change to change how it all works. All right. So that is basically routers. We're going to jump to the next one. Okay, so this is an aside about device security, specifically networking equipment security. If you have a networking device that has a default password, and so if you bought, this is most likely if you bought something from a store and you set it up immediately without somebody else going through it, it may have a default password. This is especially true for routers and wireless access points. You want to change the default password is really the takeaway from this slide is if it has a default password, you want to change it. In some cases, if you're working with an internet service provider, they may have a password that is like this long and gibberish, and that's fine. But if the default password is admin or something like that, you're going to want to change it, and you're going to want to write it down somewhere where you can find it. This is because your router is potentially visible to the outside world. Your router is the thing /firewall is the thing keeping the outside world from coming there. And you want it to make it as secure as possible, so you want to have a password on it that people can't say, oh, I bet they have this popular model, and I bet the default is admin, and oh, now I'm in your network. So yeah, so that's a piece on that. Wireless access points are true the other direction because people sitting in your parking lot can see your wireless access point. In general, they should both default so that they're not easy to just pop into, but I would recommend changing the passwords to that. Along the same lines, updates. This is true for any networking device. If they don't auto-update, and I think more of them do now, but some of them don't, you should occasionally check for security updates. Because again, the routers and access points are the ones this is most true for because they're the things that are sort of visible to the outside world. So I've talked about looking at your settings, and I've talked about updates. I didn't really tell you how you would do that. So how do you get to your router or firewall, what have you? Most of the devices, this all works the same way. All the devices are going to have an IP address, which let's just think of it as an address for now. I'm going to talk about what that means later. And what you should be able to do is while you're on your network, you plug in the IP address just in a web browser, like you're going to a website. You plug it in, it should take you to the device's web page. It'll be, it'll be the string is there, and then there's the password that you have presumably at this point changed, or the default, and you'll get to a big portal that has a bunch of different pages for changing settings. And at that point, you can go in and either change things or check things out. I did not think to take a screenshot of that. That probably would have been a good thing to do. So I'll remember that for next time. But in general, if you are doing anything like that, or if someone you're working with is doing that, that's how you access it. You have to be in the building, and you have to know the right address to get there. Let's see, I think, yeah, okay. So that was routers. Does anybody have a question that is router or modem related? It may be that it's going to be hard to tell what we are going to talk about later, but feel free to ask, and I can always say, we'll do that in about 4 slides or what have you.
Hey, Josh, I have probably the real stupid question.
No, I think you are going to be hard pressed to ask a stupid question today, but thank you.
I don't know. So on your really super helpful drawing, your illustration, you have an actual hard connection between the modem router and switch and the unnamed next thing. Are they actually physically connected, like in your picture?
Yes. So that is a great question. Yes, and I didn't describe the picture at all. So in this picture, the wire, the things that I would say, look generously like a child is drawing a wire, are intended to be wires, and in many cases, they would be, but there are definitely parts, as you're sort of implying, parts of the network that might not be physically connected. I think in most cases, the modem, router, and switch, which we will talk about in a second, would be physically connected. It's probably possible to not do that, but I think in most cases, those would be wired connections. And the little Wi-Fi signal ones are intended to imply that those are wireless, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. All right, thank you. Thanks for asking that. No, I should have given a little bit of context to this thing, even though it looks like a child drew it. All right, well, let's hop, unless anybody else has a routery question, we will hop to switches. I think, and again, yeah, it's sort of important. I think that one of the more important pieces is to kind of figure out that they each do a slightly different thing, even though they look pretty similar, and being sort of mindful of what their purpose is. So here we have a switch, and I'm going to show you a picture. Or I mean, not show you. I'm going to show you in person a couple of switches. So switches. Here is a small and somewhat old switch you can see it has, what do we got? Five Ethernet jacks in here. So switches can be pretty small, down to 5-ish, and they can be fairly sizable. So this is an older model, but this is a, I think 48 port switch. And that's, yeah, so this is so a switch can be anywhere in there. They usually range from 5 on the small end, 5, 10 or 12, 24, 48. 48's usually as big as they get. What does a switch do? So a switch basically allows you to physically connect more devices to the network using Ethernet cables. That is their purpose. This is basically almost all that a switch does. So you can have a small one, you can have multiple small ones, you can have one big one, you can have multiple big ones. If you go into a server room at a larger business or organization, you may find a ton of them. Our server room in my office building has 3 or 4 switches, each with 24 to 48 options, and is a bit of a well, can be complicated to keep track of. But in any case, that's what a switch does. A switch is a way to connect by wire, by cable, a bunch of devices to your router and your network. Okay, now these are kind of like a little more detailed nuggets about switches. First off, there are 2 kinds of switches. The normal kind that people have are called unmanaged. These are a bit cheaper. An unmanaged switch, there's no configuration that happens to it. You just plug things in, they all see each other, and it just works. You don't need to do anything else. It just does it. There are what are called managed switches. Again, this might be a little more than you need to know, but a managed switch, you can configure. It costs a little bit more. It gives you the option of, for example, and this is a thing that people frequently use, if you want to like cordon off parts of your network from other parts of your network. It's what's called a virtual LAN or a VLAN, and I didn't use the word LAN at all. Local area network is just a network. But a VLAN is basically a way for your switch to, these are the public computers. These 6 public computers can see each other and see the router, but they can't see any of the other stuff. And these 7 staff computers, same deal. They can see each other, but they can't see across. So that's why one reason you might want a managed switch. There are other ways to do it. You could also have 2 separate switches and make it so they can't see each other. But when you buy a switch, that's one of the things you would need to know about, whether it was managed or unmanaged. Another wrinkle with switches is something called power over Ethernet, which people just call PoE. With a PoE switch, the cable plugs into it, goes to the device. The cable also carries electrical power, like the kind that you plug into an electrical outlet in the wall. It carries that for a device that is that is connected. So that device, usually wireless access points, IP, which is a networked video camera, or some other weird things like that. So they don't have to plug into the wall. That's particularly true because frequently your wireless access points are in the ceiling or somewhere else, where plugging them into an electrical outlet in the wall would be a big pain in the butt. So this is another thing. Switches can be more or less expensive. PoE is more expensive, but it has this option. It's basically a question of whether this is helping you or not. If you don't need it, you don't need it. If you do need it, it can be helpful and simplify things. There are ways to plug things in like this. There are ways to get around it if you have a non-PoE switch. But again, PoE switches carry electrical power to wherever the end of the cable is, and cost a little bit more. Okay, so we have another aside that I'm going to talk about right now. Okay, so this is not exactly network equipment, but is sort of adjacent network equipment. Battery backup. It's also called an uninterruptible power supply. All right, you know what? I'm going to pick one up. Hold on one second. they are known for being heavy, among other things, because it's basically kind of like a car battery. It's not exactly a car battery, but there's a whole bunch of physical batteries in this thing. Okay, here we go. Boop, 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 boop. It just looks like a big box. It might also look like a pizza box. And in the back, it has a whole bunch of electrical outlets. So that is one model of battery backup. Again, emphasize that they are heavy. Sorry. Battery backup is a thing that some people may use and others may not. What it does is it does basically two things. So you would stick one in your network area, and plug your network equipment, your router, your modem, if you have a server, or something else, into it. I should also say you can use it in other places. So it basically in the building, it does two things. One, if the power goes out, it will keep power running to everything that's plugged into it for X amount of time. X amount of time is not necessarily a huge amount of time, depending on what's running on it. If you have a server running, it probably won't run that long. If you have, a router and a firewall, they may last quite a while. So that's thing number one. And thing number two is, more broadly, all the time they protect the equipment from power surges, power fluctuations, things like that. So the power outage one is useful, but it's also dependent on, in many cases, if power is out, your internet might also be out. And if that's true, and also your computers are probably not on. So it can be helpful depending on how things are set up. If you still have internet, there are situations where it can be helpful to have your network stuff still on power. It's mostly there so that, again, if you had that you can kind of gracefully turn things off at some point. Mostly matters if you have servers or computers on it. But more importantly, it protects your equipment. So that, how do you decide if you need it, is how much does your equipment cost, and is it worth it to buy a battery backup to try to protect your equipment? I think it's mostly a question of the sort of cost equation, and other people, vendors might have a better answer for you on that. But in general, do I need it or do I not need it? I mean, in a world, you could have a battery backup on every single computer you have, but that would be kind of wild. So you probably don't want to do that. It's just a question of if this stuff breaks. And I will say networking equipment, because it is has more of a tendency to get impacted by power surges, electrical lightning strikes, things like that. It can, because it's coming into the building and it's one of the first things that things come to. So they do sometimes get hit, and you may have found this at your, at home as well. Things getting burned out for things like that. So it can be worthwhile to protect them, but you're also just I'm buying another piece of equipment to protect the first piece of equipment. You have to figure out if the math makes any sense for you or not. Battery backups, I will also say, last a certain amount of time. I think 5 years, you were probably thinking about having to get a new one, because they're batteries like everything else, and the batteries just get weaker and weaker as time goes on. So again, I'm definitely not. If you have one, that's great. If you don't have one, that's fine. I'm not telling everybody they need to go out and buy one immediately or anything like that. Just to be aware of what they do and what the point is around them. Okay. Any questions on that section? We just talked about switches and battery backups, or anybody want to? Yeah. Anybody have anything they want to ask at the moment?
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes, 100%.
So you had me up through switches. Now, the point of a switch is to be able to cordon off sections of the network in order to be able to have them working independently?
Not necessarily. So a managed switch that's what you could do with a having multiple switches. In general, the main point of a switch is just to be able to physically connect more things to the network. So by default, that's basically what it's doing. But if you want to if you do want to cordon things off, you're going to need a switch to be doing something, basically, either having the managed kind or having multiples. Does that make general sense?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you.
awesome. Thank you. But yeah, at the end of the day, so I'll add this. Your router probably has a few Ethernet jacks in the back of it. That's enough for you, then you don't need a switch if you have enough. But if you need more, if you have more jacks, if you have more devices, then a switch is just an easy way to expand that. And so awesome. Thank you for asking that. Okay, so I'm going to hop to the next one. Okay, so we've gone through the modem, the router, and the switch. And now we're going to talk about the actual cabling. And how did I not bring a cable? Hold on one sec. Okay, so cabling, and I'm gonna go to the next slide. Cabling isn't really a device in the traditional sense. You don't plug it in. It's just there, but it's sort of a crucial part of at least the wired portion of your network. And you can have an almost entirely wireless network, but I think most folks are not at that point in libraries or businesses. So here is everybody's. Well, here. So this is the cable that I brought over here. So probably was a bad choice, but here is, yes, everybody will recognize this one. Okay, so this is cable or Ethernet cable. It includes all the cable that is running on the floor or in the wall, through the ceiling, as well as the network jacks, if you have network jacks in your wall that you plug into, or the little short cables that run from the wall to your computer, sort of all of that just gets lumped into network cable. At this point, almost the only kind of cable that anyone is going to deal with is Ethernet. There are very specific situations where somebody might be using fiber optic inside a building, but that's pretty rare and usually means something strange is going on. So it's basically Ethernet is what we're doing. Ethernet looks, I mean, you've worked with it whether you want to or not before. It looks a lot like thicker phone cable, and the jack looks almost exactly like, for those who remember, phone jack, but a little bit wider. They otherwise won't work with each other, but it looks a lot like that. Let's see. So cables you don't need to know that much about cables. I don't know this is necessary, but inside a cable, if you look very closely and I don't have a good visual for this, but very closely at the plug-in end, you will see that there are 8 different cables, 8 very small wires inside this. They have stripes and colors. You don't need to know that. It might be helpful to know that's what's in here is a series of wires that are wrapped around each other. And okay, so cabling. A thing I'm going to talk about, which some of you might have, and if you don't have, might be a little bit esoteric, is something called a patch bay. A patch bay is, it sort of looks like a switch. It's probably a thing that's kind of installed in your server area or something. It has a bunch of Ethernet jacks. Boop, boop, boop. And it's basically just a way to help organize or extend cables. The thing that you'll know that it's a patch bay and not a switch is there's no lights on it, and it does not plug into an electrical outlet. It's just basically a way to put 2 cables together. Plunk. But it can be easy to think that it's a device because it looks like it's a device that plugs in and has power and everything. So that's patch bays are a way to try to organize and make sense out of what can easily become very confusing once you have more than a few of these floating around. Yeah, so that's, again, cable is mostly just sits there and mostly just works, but is a thing that you want to be mindful of. If it breaks, doesn't break very often, but it can break. And when you need a cable somewhere else that you don't have one, and figuring out whether you want to run a line through the wall, or you just want to run it on the floor or the ceiling, or who knows what. Okay, let's see. Okay. As an aside, we're going to briefly talk about wired connection speeds. So every device that has an Ethernet jack has a maximum speed associated with it. It used to be 10 megabits per second was what things were, but that's pretty outdated, and you're probably not going to see anything that's 10. 100 has sort of been the standard for a while, 100 megabits per second. So that's sort of the default. So this is, when I say every Ethernet jack, I mean that your desktop computer, your laptop, if it has an Ethernet jack, the switch, the router, every one of them has a maximum speed associated with it. So 100 is sort of standard. 1,000, which is also called gigabit, is increasingly the thing that people are aiming for. This is basically me just making a pitch for, if you buy new equipment, I think you should think about, if you can, a gigabit should not cost that much more, but is probably a good idea at this point. The reason being that even if you don't have fiber or fast cable internet right now, there is a pretty significant chance you may get it in the coming years. So that there was, for quite a while, nobody's internet at their house or business was going to go above 100 megabits per second. So it didn't matter. Everything in the network could be that. But now, again, with fiber and cable, you can have 200, 300, 700 megabits per second. And if your equipment in the building is lower than that, it's going to bottleneck you. It's going to mean that you have this great speed, but as soon as it hits the network, everybody's going to see something notably lower than that. And I want to also add, these numbers are the maximum numbers that you will see. They, in general, you'll actually see something that is lower than this. It's like, for 100 megabits, you will never get 100, except in a lab. You will never see 100 on 100 megabits. You will probably get 60 or 70 or something. Same thing with gigabit. So basically, the long and short of that is, if you can, if you're buying equipment, you want to be mindful of whether you can get gigabit. And in fact, there is stuff faster than gigabit. There is 10 gig, which I don't think is particularly relevant at our scale at this point, but could become relevant in the coming years. Okay, so Ethernet cable, which we just talked about a minute ago, also has speeds associated with it. So depending on how old and so it's broken down by category, is what they call it. Cat. Cat 5, Cat 5e, Cat 6, Cat 6e. So it's, as time goes along, they make the cable slightly differently, so it is kind of more insulated from the wires, and you can get higher speeds on it. This mostly, my point here, I guess, is that if you are in a situation and you are it seems like maybe your cabling is bottlenecking you, then you might need to replace your cabling. Otherwise, don't worry about it. It's not, in many cases, cable is pretty forgiving, and it probably will not be your slowdown. But if you have cable that is 15 years old and you're trying to do gigabit speeds, you might find that is the point. And then you would want to replace it when you can. But nobody should preemptively go out and rip out all their cable, because that's a huge expense. And it is pretty forgiving. You can have, if you have, it's not a problem unless it's a problem. And then tiny point, in some cases, switches or routers might have one fast jack that is the one coming into the building or into the switch, and then a bunch of slower jacks, 1,100. So just be kind of mindful of that when you're doing it, when you're organizing your setup. Okay. That was cable and cable speeds. Does anybody have questions about that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
like mine's a stupid question too.
Nope,
Are
nope.
these all things that we're going to have to converse with? Like, because like endorse it, we have 2 options. Are we going to have to know all this, or are they just going to tell us this is what we can offer you? Like, can we negotiate these things? Do you buy this stuff from them, or do we go out to somebody else to set up the?
That is a great question. Again, all of these stupid questions have all been great. So this one is great too. So basically, okay, when you get internet from a provider, you can pick your provider, whoever, depending on who's available in your area. They will probably, you can always ask, but they are probably not going to want to do a lot of the inside your building stuff. In most cases, they may give you this sort of like combo device that we were talking about before, the kind of all-in-one thing. And you can see, depending on the size of your building, it's conceivable that that will cover all of your needs. I think in many cases it won't, but it might cover everything. That's probably, in most cases, that's probably all that the internet provider is going to want to do for you. They probably, again, won't hurt to ask. They might say, oh yeah, we'll do that. But in many cases, they will say, they're like, nope, we got it to there. We got there's your router doodad. We're not going to pay any attention to anything else besides that. So in many cases, what will happen is you will either want to do it in-house or you'll want to find a sort of tech vendor who, and in most libraries, this is not the most complicated thing in the world. You're not a hospital or like a financial firm or something. It's going to be, I suspect a lot of people who do computer tech support will also be able to do this, but there are places that specialize in it a little bit more. I think unless you happen to have a lot of in-house knowledge or a volunteer that knows how to do networking, or you are very petite, on the very small end, you're probably going to end up wanting to work with somebody who does this stuff regularly. The options for finding somebody who does stuff regularly, you have a few. You could just ask on the listserv, and people can say, oh yeah, I use blank and they're great, and they are located somewhere. We did a broadband and tech survey back in the summer, which is on our website. You can go there. One of the things that we broke out is we asked libraries, do they pay somebody for tech support? We didn't ask what kind of tech support, but we just said, do they pay? And so you could look at the list, find libraries near you, and just call them and say, hey, do you have somebody, and do you like them? Any of those options, whatever works. You can. So I also left one out. Another option is you can, depending on the relationship you have with, if there's a municipal government or businesses in town, or even individuals in town, you can just, if you have people you can just say, do you have a tech person you like? Any of those might get you to a good spot. But in general, I think unless you happen to have the knowledge already in-house somehow, or even a volunteer, I think setup at least, you may want to work with somebody to finagle all this, especially people who are transitioning off Fiber Connect or making any other big change in what they're doing. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And I think that for us, it'll be good to find somebody who can really help us, because we're going to be the pioneers in Dorset for like good internet.
That's awesome.
We don't have anybody we can, I mean,
Gotcha.
They have internet, but not like, I want to have the best.
Gotcha. So I will say, and this may have regional issues, but there are definitely a couple of libraries on Fiber Connect who have already left, who have had good relationships with vendors, and there could be a scale thing. I think they were on the higher end, the larger end, but they might be a good starting point as well if people are willing to make the trip around.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you. Thanks for asking. Any other questions about stuff we talked about so far? Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. We will keep trucking through then. Okay. My drawing again. Yay. Okay. This is a wireless access point. So again, some of the devices, some of the routers I showed you earlier have wireless built in. This is, again, a very old one. But a more contemporary looking wireless access point, this is sort of the one I was trying to draw and failing. It turns out I can't do curves in perspective. It looks a lot like something like this. It might have antennas on it. It might not. This one doesn't. But It looks just like a little flat thing. It is, let's see, I'll jump ahead to describe it. Okay, so basically these send out Wi-Fi. That is all they do. Depending on your space needs, you might only need one thing that is sending out Wi-Fi, or you might need a bunch. The bigger your space, the more devices you might need. The more small rooms and other walls you might need more. Depending on what your walls are made out of, that will impact how well signals go. Signals, wooden walls, not so bad. Plaster, a little worse. Brick, worse than that. Steel, worse than that. So it can vary a lot. And I think in some cases, it can be hard to tell what it's going to be like until you start putting things around. These things could be sitting on a shelf, particularly if you just have one in the middle of your building. They're also often mounted on walls or ceilings. In an ideal world, ceiling is sort of at a high point, is sort of the perfect option for getting the signal as far as possible. But you know, obviously getting on a ceiling, you need somebody to deal with that. They also can be, and during COVID, this happened, fortunately, this happened a lot. They can be on the outside of your building. They could also, in theory, be stuck like in the middle of a garden or something like that, on a flagpole somewhere, if you wanted to bring Wi-Fi to more broadly in your property, or even off your property. So they can be in a bunch of different places. Let's see. And yes, okay. So while we're talking about that, I'm just gonna, because this might come up as you're looking around, there's something called a mesh network. So not that long ago, and in fact, you can still buy them. There's something called network extenders that people would sell, and they're just a little thing you plug it in, and the idea is that it uses your Wi-Fi and then extends it further. They historically haven't worked great. They tend to, if your Wi-Fi was already weak, they were not a great help. Mesh networks are sort of the more modern version of it. So basically, in a traditional model, what I was talking about before, you'd have however many of these. Say you have 3 of these. Every one of them would plug into an Ethernet cable. The Ethernet cable would go all the way back to a switch. So they would all be connected through by a cable, and then from there would broadcast out Wi-Fi. In a mesh network, at least some of the access points, not all, because one of them still needs to be plugged in, connect to each other wirelessly. And they don't have a cable. They still need power, so you would have to figure that out. But so in a mesh network, and this is a thing that's the last 3-4 years has gotten a bigger deal because they work a lot better than they used to. Mesh networks are generally, it's going to be slower than a cabled version because it's also dependent on the Wi-Fi. But they can be easier to set up. They're especially useful if for some reason you can't run cables through parts of your building. That is, or you don't want to. Either of those are reasons that a mesh network might be an option. And there are increasingly a few different products that just get sold where you're just like, it has 3 or 4 units. You put one in the center, you put them around. Depending on your space needs, they are an option. Okay, let's see. Wi-Fi, talked about where they're located. Okay, configuration. Sorry, configuration options. Access points potentially have a lot of configuration options. Maybe not quite as many as routers, but because there are a lot of different ways you can set up your Wi-Fi network. So you can log into these. It's the same as as logging into a router, and change settings. We're going to talk about what you would be changing in 1 second, but basically it is these have things. There's also there's probably default that'll just work, but if you want to change anything, this is a spot where there are a lot of different settings that you could potentially change. Okay, so we got a couple of things that I'm going to break out because Wi-Fi access points covers the whole Wi-Fi half of your networking, which at this point is pretty significant. Okay. So when you're buying equipment, this is mostly relevant if you're buying equipment, or I guess if you're looking to replace equipment, thinking about replacing equipment. Wi-Fi standards and speeds are confusing. they're just confusing. So I'm going to start with that. They have there's different sort of generations of how advanced your Wi-Fi access point, the Wi-Fi you're sending out is. They have names like 802.11ax or 802.11be, or alternately Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 7. Those are the things that that are probably for sale right now are going to be one of those. But if you have older equipment, it could be 802.11ac or 802.11n. There's this whole evolution, but it's sort of hard to track unless it's the sort of thing that you pay attention to a lot. The short version is probably what you're getting now will be the current version and will be up to date. They're probably not going to try to sell you a dated one if you were to buy something. But again, they are a little bit gibberishy. To increase the gibberishness, you might also see a whole bevy of other terms. Bands. We'll talk about bands in a minute, but there are different frequencies that Wi-Fi can be shared out on. Then you go totally into the weeds with things like beamforming or an MU-MIMO and a lot of different. So there's a lot of like bells and whistles that a wireless access point can offer. It's hard to navigate unless you were like invested in it. So potentially you can just buy a thing that seems like it is appropriate thing. But if you're really, if you want to dig into it, you probably either need to talk to somebody who is somewhat expert about Wi-Fi, or you at least need to check out reviews on the internet. And they will say, oh, this one is great because it offers this and this and this and this. Or this one actually is overpriced, or what have you. I don't want to make it sound like you're going to get stuck. This is, in general, roughly speaking, the higher the model you buy, the more it's going to be able to do. The lower the model you buy, the less it's going to be able to do. But if it's 5 years newer than what you had before, even a cheap one is probably going to be better than the one you had before. Let's see. That was sort of a lot. So any questions based on? Oh, you know what? I'm going to do one more Wi-Fi thing, and then we'll just start doing Wi-Fi questions. Okay. So this is when you're configuring your wireless network, or someone has helped you configure your wireless network. These are things to sort of keep in mind while setting it up. The first is called is an SSID, which is basically just the identifier when somebody tries to connect to the Wi-Fi. So it might be like your library name or Josh House or whatever it is. It can be anything that you want it to be. And you can have multiples. If you want to have multiple different Wi-Fi networks, for example, you have like a staff-only network and a staff network, or like you could break out different parts of the building if you wanted to. You don't need to do that. Everything in the building can all have the same SSID, but there are reasons that you might want, if you wanted to treat them differently, then those are the reasons you might have more than one. And routers typically at this point can have more than one SSID. You could, so again, the most logical one seems like a staff and a guest or something like that, but you don't need to do that, and it's just an option out there. But okay, so it's the first thing you know about is your SSID, and this is also a thing you kind of need to know whenever you connect to somebody's Wi-Fi. What is their network called? And that's like when you pull up the Wi-Fi and you see 8 different options. That way you find the one that you need. Bands. This is a little bit in the weeds, but I just want to reference it. Wireless access points at this point offer 2 or even 3 different frequency bands. So you will see this referenced. 2.4 is the one that everything used to use. 5, at this point, probably 10 years ago, came into commonality, and 6 is the hot new thing. So you don't really need to know about these because in general, the way things mostly work now is that your phone or whatever will just connect to whichever band is best for the spot that it's in. But you might see that, and that's why I want to reference it. In general, if you just to know one more thing about it, the lower the number, 2.4 is slower, but is better at going through walls and is longer range. At the other end, 5 and 6 is much faster, but is much worse at going through walls, and has shorter range. Again, you don't really, probably whatever you buy is going to have at least 2 and possibly 3 of these, and you don't really need to get into the weeds on it, but you might see it referenced. And I guess that's sort of background. If for some reason, some places will break the 2.4 and the 5 into separate SSIDs. I think that's become pretty uncommon at this point, but it is a thing, so it will tell you, you can sort of guess which one you want to connect to. Okay. So here's a sort of quandary is, should I have a password on my public Wi-Fi? There is not a definite answer on this. People do it both ways, and there's not a consensus about what the right answer is. Obviously, if you don't have a password, it's easier for everybody to connect, and that is a plus. It is just simpler. Even if you have the password written on the window, on the wall, there's still the option for people to not get in. On the other hand, if you do have a password, if you do not have a password, basically all the information is being transmitted, what they call in clear text. It's not encrypted. It's just in the air. It's relatively easy to intercept. If you have a password, everything is encrypted. However, if everybody knows what the password is, it's not terribly complicated to reverse engineer to get in and unencrypt it if you have the password. So it's not exactly a toss-up, but there's a little bit of security that's happening at the cost of a little bit of extra work. So at the end of the day, figure out which seems to work better for you. I have opinions on this, but I think that's in general, that's the thing. And people, again, don't. I will say, okay, so what we're about to get to, security. So this is another thing that the doodad that they'll say. They have security used to be something else, and then there was WPA, which was better than the old things, and then WPA2, which was better than that, and now WPA3 is rolling out. WPA3 is significantly more secure, and in fact, my understanding is more secure even if it's a known password. So I think if you happen to have something that offers WPA3, you might want to offer a password because you are getting more positives from it. It's harder for people to have their data intercepted. But yeah, so I could go into more detail on my understanding of this, and somebody who's a Wi-Fi expert might have a whole different realm of knowledge on that. But that is my sense. And then I will just briefly talk about Wi-Fi statistics because I'm the statistics person. So Wi-Fi statistics can be depending on what your device is and how your network is set up, have a continuum from being super easy to get stats to almost impossible. And it depends on what your device is. For some sort of higher end equipment, especially Meraki is the thing I'm thinking of, and one of the things about them is you will know they're higher end because they will have a monthly subscription that is charged to you, which is not always the case for this stuff. A lot of this stuff you buy and you just have, but some of it that has more bells and whistles, again, like Meraki and a few other things, will have a monthly subscription involved. But the positive is they give you really good stats. You go in and there's a whole bunch of data that you can access that is easy. You can look at it over time. So there are some devices, and I'm not sort of name dropping Meraki. They're just the one that I'm aware of. There are other things that do this. So for them, getting stats is easy. It's just like straightforward. They want to give you the stats. For a lot of devices that are sort of in this middle ground, they will have a log. And so you can kind of do some work. You can, what you can do, it'll have a log of everything that connected in the last 24 hours, for example. You can look at that and count them up and say, all right, this was 15 things connected in the last 24 hours. And you could do that for a week, or you could do that once a month as just a way to get a ballpark of it. You could look at it every single day, but that seems like a lot of work for that number. So I would probably not do that. But this is a way to get a better thing, a better number, but it does require a little bit of work. On some devices, they have super basic logging and they don't give you a lot of flexibility. So it may be even hard to do that option. So this is a long-winded way of saying that wireless stats are a pain and a challenge for libraries. And this is true nationwide, not just Vermont. It is something that we are perpetually struggling with. It's a challenge because it's a super important stat. Increasingly, it is one of the core things that we offer, but it can be very hard to track. And then when you get it, there are a couple of different metrics, and it's hard to figure out which one do you want to track. Sessions, so that's every time somebody connects, they are a session. Or do you want to track time? A lot of these, time in some ways is more useful, but only some things will give you time. And again, this is a long-winded way of saying probably you're stuck with whatever you have, and it can be hard to navigate. I'm also always happy to talk about that down the line if you really want to get into the weeds. I will say for the annual report, we'll take whatever you have. If you don't get wireless stats, that's not a problem. But hopefully, gradually, we will all get to a spot where it is easier to at least get these estimates and have a good idea, because I think Wi-Fi usage seems like it is ramping up across the board, particularly post-COVID. Yes. Okay. That was a whole bunch of Wi-Fi stuff. And again, that's arguably almost half of your network. But what questions do folks have about Wi-Fi? Wi-Fi setup, access points, anything like that?
So if you're not dealing with a mesh network, then all of your Wi-Fi access points are going to be hardwired?
Yes. Okay, I should say probably. The caveat is there's a mesh network, and then there's things called extenders, which do the same thing. I think that in general, people had not had great experiences with extenders. So normally, yes, normally all of your access points are going to be wired. I think if you can do that, that is probably is going to be the best practice for you. But if there are reasons that it's not workable, then you could look at a mesh network. You could even look at extender. I would probably avoid them if I could.
So back to that initial question that I had then. So if you have wireless access points in, say, a brick or a cement block building, and you pointed out that there's different bands, right? So 2.4 is going to be able to get through those walls, whereas like a 5 or a 6 won't. Will individual devices know which one to connect? So like if I've got a wireless access point in one room, but somebody who's in a meeting room is behind a brick wall, will their devices automatically try to connect to the 2.4 band, or is that something that has to be set? You're muted, Josh.
I have this doodad on my headset that I always run into on my desk. Thank you. So devices have gotten, phones and laptops have gotten a lot better about automatically doing that. There was a time when they just wouldn't. You basically were making choices. So they should be a lot more automatic than they were before. They should know where they're getting the best connection and should hop to that. That being said, in many, with buildings that have either a lot of cul-de-sacs or brick walls or what have you, you may end up finding as time goes along that you would ideally like to have more access points than you would think than your square footage would imply. And it's people who do this professionally might be able to give you like a really good idea without having to do a lot of testing. Other things you could do is you could just get, you could get one access point, move it all around the building, see what signal you're getting. That's a little involved too. But so I'm trying to feel like if there's any rules of thumb on this. In an ideal world, every room would have its own access point, but that's not always not really practical. It can be kind of tricky to figure out, because in some cases, if you have different floors, it may move through floors easier than it is moving through walls. It also may not. You might be right above an access point, and you might have a great signal right there. I think, yeah, it's you could kind of try to eyeball it and think about where, again, brick and steel walls are going to be the worst, and you may get on the other side of one, but you're probably not going to get on the other side of one and a great distance. Or if you're going through two brick walls, for example, your signal is probably going to be very bad, or pretty bad. I will say another thing is that as time has gone along, new access, each of these technologies is generally goes a little further than it has before and is faster. So even if you end up with a slower version of it, you're still only getting 10% of the maximum speed. The maximum speed might still be workable. So that's another thing to think about. But you know, at the end of the day, your building structure is going to have a pretty big impact on this, and there's not a magical way to get around it except to put a bazillion of them in your building, and that is its own challenge, both cost and organizationally. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you, except to say that it is a thing. It is challenging to figure out exactly where people are going to be able to get a signal and where the signal is gonna croak out. And yeah, I mean you could try again. You could sort of try getting some kind of unit and just marching it around the building everywhere that you have a jack, and then seeing how able you are to connect with it. Oh, well, I'm going to say this later, but I'll say it right now in case I forget. One thing to be mindful of and this is sort of true through life in general, is when you have your wireless, you have your phone or what have you, that your wireless, when it shows you the little what the wireless signal is on your phone or device, it tells you how good your connection is to whatever it is you're getting it from. It does not tell you how fast the speed you're getting from that is. So you could have a great connection with a lousy access point, or you could have a lousy connection with a great device, and it's not giving you a real handle on that. What I would recommend when you're marching around testing is doing a speed test, getting connected on to the device, and then doing a speed test, and that will give you a better handle for how it's really going to work in the real world. There are apps on phones. Where do I have that? There is something called Wi-Fi Analyzer that I put on my phone that sort of gives you, let's see, nope, there's a visual that I want to give you. Oh, this visual is terrible. Come on. They can give you some ideas about what this visual is awful. I apologize. So I'm not even going to show it. Okay, there are apps that you can have that are called Wi-Fi Analyzer. They'll give you a sense for where it's good or bad in the building. They don't do a speed test, so they won't exactly tell you what the speed you're getting is. They are especially useful if you're in a place where there are a lot of other Wi-Fi networks around you. And this is a thing that I didn't put on the slide, but that's a point where you can change this is a little bit in the weeds. You can change the channel that you are moving on. You can kind of nudge it. If there's a lot of people that are in a certain part of the spectrum, you can move yourself another way. But yeah, there are apps there that might help. But my default is to connect to the network, try a speed test, see how good it is, march 30 feet, do it again, and see what it looks like. But it is a thing. It's especially a thing in buildings that have big sturdy walls, and it's especially a thing in buildings that have big sturdy walls and that you're not really allowed to drill holes and put cable around. And I will say, if anything that I say today did not get at what you wanted, we can talk about it more later, but I'm always happy. Any tech questions, you are always welcome to send my way. I may not have the answer. I will hopefully find you more of an answer or put you in a direction of answers. But as you're just going through your library life, whenever you hit things that seem like roadblocks or what have you, don't ever hesitate to reach out. Any other Wi-Fi questions that people want to talk about right now? We'll also have just a bunch of question time at the end. So, okay, we will hop ahead. Okay, so this is the sort of where your network gets to. Desktops, laptops, also phones, tablets, printers, sort of any of the sort of clients that end up being on the network. I mean, in a sense, they're not part of the network, but they're the whole point behind the network. So I thought I would include them. Okay. I will say, okay, so there was a time before the internet when networks were primarily there so that all the computers on the network could reach each other or could reach a server in the building or what have you. Nowadays, mostly people just want to get to the internet. There are exceptions, but that is the default for so many things at this point. You might have a server in the building or some other like storage. More likely you have a printer. A printer is the thing that you are most likely to probably want to reach in the building that does not require going out to the internet. Okay, so here's a little elaboration on that. Okay, there was a time when libraries tended to have servers in the building because that was what the ILS ran on. There was physically a server, and a server is really just a computer, maybe a fancy computer, maybe not a fancy computer, but a server when libraries tended to have one in the building. As we've moved along, more and more people are using web-based ILSs, and in many cases, people are moving to cloud-based storage or something like that. So there are a lot less servers in buildings. Servers can offer a bunch of different functionality, something called a domain controller, which has to deal with Windows computers dealing with each other. File server, which is basically just like you have a bunch of files, everybody can see them from the central point. A web server, which is you're running a website, or an application server. In this case, you were running an ILS. So they can do a lot of things, but they bring I think, a dramatic increase in administrative complexity in maintaining the server, and there are also security concerns to having a server. So in general, my default is if you cannot have a server, great, don't have a server. If you have to have a server, then that's fine. You just need to be mindful of it. It makes everything a little more complicated because there's this other thing that you need to maintain and keep an eye on. It is a sort of potential security issue, especially if it's somehow visible to the outside world. So yeah, so that's servers. If you have, yeah, that's my talk on servers. I just wanted to also say something called network attached storage. They tend to be like everything else, looks like a box this big. It's basically like a simplified file server. It's a way to share files with everybody in the building. It is a lot simpler than a server. If you just need file storage in the building, it's definitely an option. So you don't really, these are not super, well, okay. They do, they have some ramifications for how your network is set up because everything needs to be able to see the server or the file network attached storage. But yeah, so that's that. You may or may not have these. Like I said, in many cases, people are moving to the cloud for a lot of these needs. Okay, so just want to talk about VoIP for a second. VoIP, which is voice over IP, is basically phone service that runs on your network, that runs on Ethernet cables, rather than using what we think of as a traditional phone line. At this point, so typically a VoIP phone just looks like a normal phone. It just plugs into an Ethernet jack instead of a telephone jack, and it is part of your network. It often requires some sort of specific switch or router or device to sort of manage the VoIP, voice over IP in your building. But otherwise, it's not, I don't know, it's as complicated as other things are, but it is definitely an option. And I think a lot of people are moving over to it because it can sometimes be cheaper. It's at least, you don't necessarily require those traditional copper phone lines that you might have had before. One wrinkle on that, if you're ever looking at VoIP, is you need to talk to folks about if you have a fire alarm or an elevator alarm. There are, just because there are there are, what am I trying to say? The state rules about these things having a sort of backup, having multiple, like traditionally they were the sort of copper phone lines, and you can move them over to IP VoIP phones, but there are, I think, requirements around that because if the power goes out, your VoIP is probably not going to work. I think that there are, but the people who would be working on something like that might have answers, but I would just make sure that you don't just yoink them out and like, oh yeah, it's fine, everything's VoIP, because you might find yourself out of compliance with the rules. My impression, I think that I've heard this sort of secondhand, is that some people were able to switch over to a system where they have VoIP, and then as a backup, there's a cell connection, and that had the two systems, which is what people were requiring. I am no expert on either building requirements around alarms or VoIP or cell, but I believe I mostly just want people to know that that is a wrinkle if they decide to make that move. And for this, I mostly just wanted to put in a reminder that VoIP exists, and especially if you're changing your network around, if you're not using it now, it might be a thing you want to think about. It can be a cost savings. It can also give you some options that you couldn't do before. Okay, VoIP, and okay. All right, I'm just going to power through 2 more slides, and then we'll just go to questions on everything. Okay, this is where we start getting into the weeds a little bit. But networking, almost every device on a network has some basic info settings sort of that allow it to be found and allow it to find other devices. In some cases, you don't need to mess with this, but you need to sort of have it in the back of your mind in case you do need to mess with it. Okay, so first off, every device that is connected has an IP address. It's sort of like a phone number for the device. It is so everything on the network can keep track of it, can send things to it, and if they get a request from it, can send it back to it. These numbers have a series of 4 numbers broken up by periods. The numbers go from 0 to 255. So basically, the lowest possible number is 0.0.0.0, and the largest possible number is 255.255.255.255. So you will never see a number that is higher than that in these IP numbers. Okay, so again, this is a little more in the weeds, but the numbers from left to right go from broad to sort of more to narrow. So basically, the leftmost number is a huge thing. It's sort of like an area code on phones. For like, if the first digit, one number might be a country. I'm kind of playing fast and loose with that, but you can think of it. It might be a country. The next one up might be a state. Again, this is not literally how it works, but it's just kind of to give you an idea. And then the next number might be a sort of a smaller network like that. So in most cases, the last 3 digits, the last 0 to 255, all the things on your network are going to be within probably one range of those. You might, if you have divvied up your network into different places, you might have different IP addresses. You don't really need to go into the weeds into this. It's just sort of generally that's how it works. This is what the number looks like. You will see these numbers occasionally, and you can kind of deduce them. These numbers I'm giving you is something called IPv4. This is sort of the older and current version. There's something new called IPv6. It looks roughly similar. The numbers are much bigger. IPv6 is something that they've needed to use because they ran out of numbers for networks. But it looks roughly similar, but is much larger. And there will be a time when probably everyone will just use that on its own. But at the moment, people are probably using both IPv4 and IPv6 at the same time. Again, I'm in the weeds here. This is mostly only relevant if it comes up. Okay, IP addresses. How do devices get their IP address? Usually the default is that the router gives you the address, or it gives each device an address just automatically. It's something called DHCP. It's just dynamically assigned IP addresses. If you're on a network, if you stay on a network all the time, your device probably will just keep getting the same IP address. It will probably stay the same. But if you come off the network and come back, or you go to a different network or whatever, it may. Oh, and I just thought of an important thing to say about IP addresses. Again, this is sort of in the weeds, and I just want you to know that it exists. Okay, how do you get an IP address? The router assigns it, or if you need for something that needs to always have the same address, like a printer maybe, or a server, you can give it a reservation, or what's called a static IP. A reservation is you do it on the router, and the device always gets the same thing. Static IP is you do it on the computer, and it just says, this is my address, blink. Again, you don't need to worry too much about that. But a thing that I totally failed to describe is there are external and internal IP addresses, and they're not the same thing. So in your network, you will have, every device will have an IP address. It is probably, there are a few ranges that are set aside for inside networks. So you'll have a full set of numbers, but they will only work inside your network. They often go 192.168.something.something, and that is how you know you're in a network. So it is a network. It tells everything in your network how to get to your device, but it is not. But it is not out in the world. Out in the world, if somebody used that number, it wouldn't go anywhere. It will not come magically to your thing. There is separate something called an external IP address. This is mostly important. Sometimes you need to know it to get to certain services. Some database products allow things by your external address. If you ever need to know your external address, what you want to do is Google, what is my IP address? And Google will tell you what your external IP address is. It also could be arranged. Anyway, I'm sorry. This is sort of, I've gotten into a bit of a rat's nest here. The most important piece is that everything in your network has an IP address. In many cases, you'll just let it assign itself, but you might need a reason to set it. And these numbers are all internal for your internal network, and are not visible to the outside world. There's another thing called a subnet mask. You will see that. I will say that you will see it. It tells your computer how big the network you're attached to is. It's a thing that it needs to be right for it to work, but it's usually going to be there by default. Yes, question.
So when we started this whole discussion, you were saying that if you needed to look at the modem, you need to know the IP address for the modem. So does that mean that a device is assigned an IP that is not related to the internal IP address? Or is that, I don't know. So I'm a little confused how that works then.
That is confusing. Okay. Let me take a step back and think. So almost everything in your building and on your network will have an IP address associated with it that is visible from within your network. The big exception, like switches, unmanaged switches don't have one because you can't reach them. There's nothing there. Almost everything else, your router, your wireless access point, and your modem, in this case, will have a IP address inside the network that you can get to. The external network is your external IP address is sort of a confusing. Everything on the network will have a number that is effectively being shared. That is your one external IP address. You kind of don't need to know it. Other people might need to know it. You will never use that to get anywhere. To get to your modem, for example, you will use this internal number that is probably built into the modem in all likelihood, and you might have to look up.
So that's where I lose you, because from what I'm understanding, you're saying is that they are locationally specific addresses, but then you're saying that the address is built into the device itself, and that's where I get confused.
Okay. Yes. No, it is confusing. Let us say that let's put modems in another camp for a second, because they're a little bit of a weird option. Everything else in it, your router will have a number that when you plug it in, it will probably just have a number that is the default from the store, basically, and then you will set it to something after that. Or you'll just keep the default. Either of those are fine. Everything else gets its number from the router, and it will be in whatever range the router is set to assign numbers. So all of those things, and they will only have an internal number. The internal number is set by the router. It will either be the default to how the router is set up, or you will say, give it some specifics. I want all the numbers to go between here and here, or these should be between here and here, and there should be between there and there. Modems are weird, just across the board, sort of, because they're kind of midway between the two things. They're kind of on your network, but only kind of. They're not, in a sense, your network really starts with your router, but the modem is there. So what the modem will, like I'm trying to figure out the way to describe this. Your internet provider will probably never tell you to look at your modem's webpage. But you can. It has a weird default address, probably, that is just built in, or that possibly the ISP has given it. And to find that, you will probably just, while you have internet, you will probably Google it and say, I have an X kind of modem, what kind of number? It's also fair to just say, I'm never going to look at my modem. I'll say, when I look at my modem, occasionally when I have an internet outage in the building and I want to figure out if there is where the problem is happening, and ruling out the modem, because the modem might give me a little bit of information about whether it's there. You can also, there's a good starting point is if you look at your modem, it will probably have a light that is off if the system is out. In general, the modem is not a normal go-to thing, except if something is broken, and it is kind of a weird exception because it's in this kind of ambiguous state between the outside world and your network. And so it will have this default that is probably just built into it, and you probably can't change, and it doesn't get it from anywhere on your network. Does that I sort of went in a weird direction with that, but does that kind of?
No, that definitely helps. Thank you.
Thank you much. And that was a great question. At the end of the day, normally everything in your network has the IP address that the router gave it or that you gave it. So yeah. Yes. Okay. Subnet mask. I mostly just want you to know it's a thing that you might need to fill in if you were giving something all the settings. But if, for example, you're using DHCP or reservation, it will just set it. And it is going to look something like 255.255.255.0. But you don't need to figure it out because they can be very confusing. I found like a 2-hour class on subnet masks. That's just subnet masks. So again, hopefully won't have to deal with that. Gateway. This is another thing. And I'll talk about a diagnostic that will show all these things. Gateway is a thing that's basically your device wants to know where should it go to reach the outside world and to get any information. This is almost always your router. And your router probably has, the default is often something like the address, whatever the beginning part is, and .1 is often the router. So it just needs to know where to find the router. Again, if you use DHCP, it'll just find it, and all this gets set on its own. MAC address. I just wanted to mention MAC address. This is not a thing that you directly need. Every single interface on a device has a MAC address. It is unique in the universe. There is only one. So for example, if you have a laptop, the Ethernet jack on a laptop has one has one MAC address, and the Wi-Fi has a second MAC address. You don't usually need to know MAC addresses, but every once in a while you do. So you just need to know that they exist. And it's the numbers and letter combinations look like on this slide, and they look gibberishy. But every once in a while, the example I thought of is if you wanted to reserve an IP address on the router for a specific device, you would need to know the device's MAC address. There are some other reasons you might need it, but I just mostly want you to know it exists. Okay, and then we have one more slide, and then we are opening up to general questions. We can go back to anything. Okay, one more aside is some diagnostics you could use when you get stuck, when things are not working the way you want. There's an infinite amount of Googling that you could do, and it will give you advice as well. But a few things you can start with are on a Windows computer, if you can open up the command prompt, which is if you have the little like search box, if you just say CMD, it will pop open and you will see the old command like DOS command prompt. And you can say ipconfig, and it shows your device's IP address, subnet mask, and gateway. And it's just a way to, if something is going bad, it might give you some information, or it might give you information you can pass on to somebody else who can help you with it. Yes, that's probably other operating systems. If you have Mac or Linux or Chrome, probably have a similar command, but I don't know it off the top of my head. Okay, you can also, while you're in the command prompt, which again looks like a little DOS window, you can run something called ping. Ping is when you're trying to reach another device on your network or off your network. Actually, it works either way. Usually you need to know the IP address of the device. So you're like, this laptop can't see the router, or it can't see a printer, or it can't see the file server, or it can't see some other thing. You can, if you know its IP address, you can say ping IP address, and it will tell you it worked, or it'll say no response, no response, no response. But one little caveat is not everything will respond to a ping. Some things are set to not do anything with that. So your mileage may vary, I guess. And then I mentioned this before, speed tests. Speed tests can be a good diagnostic tool to see if there is a slowdown. If there's a stoppage, they're not really going to learn much. But if there's some part of your network that is slower than the rest of your network, or if everything is slow, a speed test can give you some information. There's a bunch of them on the internet. I use fast.com, but that's just because somebody at state IT pointed me that direction. Okay, here's the thing that I just thought of that I did not include, which is if you're ever in a situation where you want devices to be able to see each other, like you want one computer to see another computer, and normally you don't care about that, but there are situations where something needs to see something else. If you're running like some of the PC reservation software, or if you're running certain versions of the deep freeze or something like that, they need to be able to see each other. Often by default, they can't see each other. The Windows firewall is often made so that it won't let anything in. And so if you get to a spot where you're doing that and you hit a roadblock, that might be one of the problems. Okay, I could probably spend another 20 minutes on that, but I won't. This is that is the end of my slides. I'm going to open up for general questions. A thing that I totally forgot to include a slide for is there are a couple of classes on Udemy that might be a good option if you want to do just a little bit more on sort of the basics. There is a 2-hour crash course, and then there is another one that is called Introduction for Non-Techies, but it's still 18 hours long. So I don't know if that one is, then they go up from there. But I think the 2-hour one, if you want more, could be an option. There's also plenty of stuff on the internet for networking basics. If you get really into networking, there's certifications that you can get. Those are involved and maybe overkill for your need, but maybe you want to do networking on the side, and in which case that's great. But yes, okay, so the class, and I'll type it in, Introduction to Computer Networking 2-hour crash course is the one that I liked on Udemy. That seemed like it was the best option. That one is 2 hours, and then there's a 2-hour edition that is all about IP addresses and subnet masking, which you don't necessarily need unless you need. And Udemy, as a reminder, is open to all, it's available to all public libraries in the state and everyone in the state through their public library. But if you have questions about how to get to Udemy, you can get to it through Vermont Online Library, but there's also individual links if you want to put that on your site. Okay, sorry, I've been talking. Questions? Anything networky? Diane, yes, if you want to unmute yourself, please.
Thank you.
Hop in.
I have a question about IP addresses. I got a quote yesterday, and one of the things they said was I could add a block of 5 IP addresses that would be an additional $20 per month. Why would I add a block of 5 IP addresses?
Okay, that is a beautiful, a great question and a beautiful transition to something. So okay, I was talking about external. So this is talking about external IP addresses. That's what they're referencing here. So external IP addresses is by default in many cases, and you could, it might be worth asking what you get if you don't get that. So in the default sort of situation is your network, particularly at your small network, has one external IP address. Everything that's coming looks like it is this one address. And then everything, the router figures out where it goes. Like if I go to Google and someone else is going to YouTube, the router knows that even though we're sharing the same external address, it comes back to the right place. That's one of the magical things the router does. So by default, you have one address. And there are, you might have a static address or a not static address. And this might actually be what another part of what they're talking about. If you have a static address, you always have the same address. It never changes. My external address is 1.1.1.1, and I will always be there. This is most relevant if you don't have a static IP address. You have a dynamic one. It might change over time. It probably will stay the same for long periods of time, but it could conceivably change. For example, at home, I have Comcast. My external IP address tends to stay the same. It could change at any moment, but it tends to just sit there. Why does this matter? External IP address matters for 2 reasons. One, again, like I said, some database vendors and websites or whatever use IP authentication. They see your IP address and they say, oh, I know which one you are. You're on my list. You can come in. I think, I know that's come up in libraries where that happens sometimes. So if you have a dynamic one, you have to give them what you have, and it might change occasionally. You might have to update it, but that's not that important. What is more important is if there's some reason that people need to get into your network regularly, then that is the biggest reason you would need a static IP address. Mostly if you have a server that people should be able to get to. You have a web server, or you have your ILS as a server in your building that people need to get to. That is a reason that a static IP, external IP would be important. If you don't have that, it probably matters a lot less. So by default, you have one usually. There's just one and it's shared. If you would need multiples like they were offering you, if you were doing different things, like, oh, here's our web server. It has this address. We want to use that address here. But then we also have the one that we're using for everything else. And then we have another one. So again, I think that if you have a server in-house or something like that, you are more worried about this. And if you don't have a server in-house, I'm not sure that it's going to impact you. But I would ask, so I don't think that you need 5 necessarily, but I would ask what you get if you don't pay for any, because having a dynamic external IP address may not impact you at all. You just want to know. And yes, so that doesn't, unfortunately, didn't really answer your question about whether that's important or not. I think my guess is it is probably not a thing that you 100% need. Again, unless you're one of those libraries who has some sort of server that you're running in the building that is either your ILS runs, and to elaborate on that, if you use Koha or Verso or Library World or probably a number of other things, you do not have your ILS in your building. Your ILS is in the cloud. If you are on Follett comes to mind. I think Follett might still have in buildings. A few other things might have an in-building server. If you have that, this is more relevant to you. But I would still figure out. I would ask them what you get if you don't do that. If you get any static IP or if you only get a dynamic IP, it might not impact you one way or the other, but that would be my question.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And that was a great question. And I will just one more nugget. Depending on where you are, you may have an external IP address, but like in this case, you could have a range. We, through the state, have this huge swath of addresses. At any given moment, my external address could be anything in this range. When we work with schools sometimes have one external IP address, but might have a range. And this only matters if somebody needs your IP address for some reason. So, which is usually a vendor for doing something like that. Okay, other questions that people might have, and it could be really anything network or networking adjacent. I'm just going to write the class in the chat, so it's in here. Or the class that I saw, that is. But yeah, any other, some of this is in the weeds and you may not ever need to know it. I think for me, the biggest takeaways, that actually the childish map is almost the biggest takeaway, is knowing that there are these different devices and they each do slightly different things, and what they do and how you need to, what they might, the care and feeding of a router versus the care and feeding of a switch. That's, if you're there, I think that's the biggest takeaway. And then after that, it's like, what are these particulars and how do I start troubleshooting when things go wrong? And that is more art than science to my mind. I will say, okay, I guess I'll say when I'm diagnosing, the thing that I'm trying to figure out is where is the problem, which in some cases means what's the last thing that works and the first thing that doesn't work. And not insignificant amount of the time, if your internet's just out, it's just making sure that your internet is out and it's not anything inside your network. It's usually just your internet. But things don't break that often, but they do break occasionally, and even or weird things can happen within them. So, but I am always happy to. I mean, if something is actively broken, you can reach out to me. I'm not necessarily going to be the speediest response, but I'm always happy to help on that. But in general, I'm always happy to answer computer and networking questions. I'm no expert on either, but I can often find answers that might help. So, any other things people want to bring up? Obviously, if you think of something a day from now, just email me and I'm happy to answer it. Okay, I think that is great. I still went a little longer than I thought I would, but shorter than, oh yeah, thank you. Great question. Zero way you can access slides after this without having to rewatch. Yes, absolutely. So within the next few days, the YouTube, there's a spot on our website, which is all the old webinars. go in one place. So there will be the YouTube link to it, and then right underneath it will be the PowerPoint, the link to the PowerPoint as well. So thank you for asking that. But yeah, that will be up in the next day, or we'll say next 3 days. Yeah, and I think that we fielded everything that I thought of. But okay, actually, so I don't think, unless Joy has one, I don't have an official feedback form. I might actually send out a feedback form. But even if I don't send one out, I would love suggestions for topics that we didn't cover, or things that you think we could just blop out, because I think I did get in the weeds a little bit next time. And you can just email me that at your leisure. But okay. Well, I let everybody go. Thank you so much for attending today. I really appreciate it. And definitely do not hesitate to get in touch with me at any point about anything tech related, and we'll see if we can find an answer together. Thanks all. Appreciate it. Have a good one. Thank you.
Hey, do you anticipate offering any other technology type courses in the near future?
Hopefully, I guess is the answer. Yes. I mean, the required ones definitely will have to happen in some fashion, whether it's me or someone else. But the sort of the broad, like, we'd like to have a pretty full curriculum of things that are happening, and I'm hopeful that we will be doing more of those in-house as we go on. But definitely, there will definitely be enough classes to fulfill the certificate requirements. Those will definitely happen, and then beyond that, I'm hopeful that we will sort of have a nice range of offerings, and we'll get this so this all happens on a regular basis. But I can't say exactly when or what that will look like.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. And if there's always feel free to, if you have an idea for a topic that you think would be great, just also tell us that. And that goes across the board. That's any kind of the CE that we do, but especially computers.
Well, I have trouble identifying those types of.
That's fair.
Because it's so theoretical to me. It's really hard for me to conceptualize a lot of it. But so these are extremely helpful.
Awesome. Well, good. Thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
Take care. Bye, all.